Right, hello. Welcome to this interview with my guest, Ruanni Tupas. Ruanni is at the University College London, and he's an expert in English in the world and the politics involved in English in the world. And particularly one of his main concepts that he has contributed very actively in developing is the idea of unequal Englishes. So we'll be discussing about that as well during this interview. So first of all, Ruanni, I'm very curious to know from you, from a personal point of view, how did you become an academic? What made you become an academic?
I am from the Philippines, and when I actually, I actually did my undergraduate studies in English language studies as well. And one of the my major frustrations at the time was that I really couldn't find myself in the things that I was learning. I think that was, not just a couple of years ago, actually. In other words, the frameworks, the linguistic theories that we were, learning, I couldn't really apply it to my multilingual self.
Can relate.
Yeah, that's right. So it was so difficult to basically relate to my own multilingual realities as a Filipino, as someone who speaks, different languages, and even, someone who speaks, a variety of Englishes as well.
Yeah.
And so that became some kind like a personal, agenda on my part, to find out more about, or to read more about myself and how to actually make sense of my own reality as well. And so if going back to your question, so it's more about looking around, we had limited resources as well, but looking around for any possible, book and article that could actually help me make sense of who I am as a multilingual speaker.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So are we talking about your undergraduate years?
It started as in the undergraduate years, but when I did my MA, that's when everything started really in terms of the formal academic search for answers, basically.
So essentially, you were involved in this course of study that you couldn't easily relate to, and that in itself stimulated this curiosity and interest in kind of, okay, what's beyond this? How to make sense. So what was it particularly that you felt was not relevant to you?
No, good question. I can give you one very concrete example, really, and that was already when I started teaching. I mean, I was, in the Philippines in the master's program. We could already teach in the undergraduate. So I was asked to teach phonology, and more morphology, and already my encounter was extremely excruciating because I was taught in a way that I needed to transcribe the sounds of English according to a certain standard, American Standard English. And so when I was, in a sense, producing the sounds, and the students were capturing my sounds, which were, of course, not the American, variety of English. So I was torn. Between, so how should I correct this? I mean, I was taught that what they were just transcribing is wrong. Because it's not the correct way of, pronouncing these sounds. But why should I fault them for capturing my own sound? Right? So it was, it was very difficult. I don't even actually know exactly how I was able to, perhaps I wasn't able to address it, perhaps I was even prescriptive at that time. But that's, I think, very, very, that's a very concrete example of my struggle, really. And like, how do I, make sense of this? This is how we all speak. This is how the sounds that we produce, and yet they're not correct.
Interesting. So there was a clear tension between what the expectation was. That you needed to, as a teacher of phonology, you're supposed to somehow teach and reproduce the conventions of American English.
That's right.
I mean, in the context of the Philippines, American English is the variety is more prestigious, right?
Yes, that's right.
Then you as a local teacher, teaching local students, were producing your English, and
Yeah.
somehow that wasn't supposed to be correct.
Yes.
But it was the English that everybody and you yourself was using. So it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I can see
That's
how
right.
there was that kind of conflict almost.
In a sense, it was a reality check for me as well, because all the while I was thinking of these sounds as being able to be, I mean, as being transcribed in a particular way. But when I was producing the sounds for the students to, in a sense, to capture them,
Yeah.
it was a reality check because it's different. You know,
Yes.
so why is this the way it is? You know.
I know. Why is it? I mean, was there at any point a feeling of being inadequate
Yes. Yes.
in that experience?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
definitely. The feeling of being inadequate, of always there's always a lack, you know, that you had to fill in. But that lack is something that is unachievable, because we know that, you know, linguistically speaking, you know, you can just probably approximate something, but not necessarily to
Yeah.
be able to really produce the sounds that you
Yeah.
really wanted it. So yeah, you're right. It's the feeling of lack, the deficit. You know, it's
Deficit,
always this
yeah.
whole idea that
Yeah.
you know, there's something lacking in me. Why is this that this is how I think it should be?
Yeah.
When the students are telling me that's not how I'm producing them.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, but in that particular experience must surely resonate with the experiences of so many other people
Yeah.
around the world, more or less in a similar situation. Right? There's some expectations about what is correct and what is the right way.
Yeah.
And then, and then what you actually produce, and somehow there's that feeling of it. How did you resolve eventually, or how did you come to terms or resolve that initial feeling of being inadequate?
It's a long process. Actually, I'm not sure, but I don't think I was able to resolve it that soon, really. I mean, it was probably beyond my PhD, beyond my PhD journey,
Yeah.
you know, because I think the idea of having that deficit, you know, understanding of yourself, you're being multilingual,
Yeah.
you're being a Filipino speaker of English, for
Yeah.
example, all of these things coming to you, they're not just simply a feeling, but it's part of your identity. And so to be able to overcome it, I think you need to overcome who you are, basically. And so looking back, I mean, it's a great question, actually, because probably I can say probably only very recently.
Yeah.
Because all the while, you know, I have, you know, somehow continuously described myself as a non-native speaker of
Yes.
English. All right, despite all the critical social linguistic work that I've been doing.
Yeah.
And so it's a framework, I think, that is so massively ideological that it continues to define you.
Yes.
And to the point that you actually cannot, you know, make any changes to yourself.
Yes.
And so only very recently, I think, that I have been able to overcome it, in the sense of it as moving away from describing myself as a non-native speaker of English to a multilingual speaker of English.
Yes.
You know, coming to terms with the idea that my being a multilingual speaker is actually a contribution to my English.
Yeah.
You know, when in fact, through the years, through the decades that I have been teaching, it's supposed to be set aside, glossed over, erased, in favor of this whole idea of being non-native speaker, which now I think I can basically say it wasn't my choice to be called a non-native speaker.
No. And what's really striking there between these two terms is how negative one is.
Yes.
The prefix non.
Exactly.
It can be more negative.
Exactly.
And,
yes.
and you know, the counterpart, multilingual speaker of English, that's so much more positive. You know, it's an asset to be able to speak different languages, and one of them is English.
Because looking at the term non-native, right? It's like defining yourself according to who you are not.
You're not. Yeah. Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
So who am I? I am not. So in a sense, you are. What is attached to you, that your identity is, you are not something, or you're not someone.
Yeah.
All right. So in a sense, that's the lack. And
That is the lack.
you know, again, despite all the critical work, I think it's there because it's part of who you are. That's how
Yeah.
I internalize it, really.
It's interesting, isn't
Yeah.
it? Because it almost becomes, I mean, I mean, defining yourself as what you're not inevitably has the deficit inbuilt.
Yes.
Right? You can't,
Yes.
deficit and not are the part of the
Exactly,
same thing,
yes,
right?
yes,
I'm
yes.
not this, and therefore I am, in a deficit position. But it's also interesting that what you're saying is how much that notion pervaded your mind and self-perception, despite the reading and the critical, ideas have been put forward in sociolinguistics, etc. But because I suppose it affects you and affects us, people like us, so deeply sometimes that it's difficult to fully
Embrace it.
embrace it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you're right. Yeah.
It becomes part of your inner self.
Exactly.
Doesn't
Yeah,
it?
that's right.
Yeah. And then what we also find really interesting in that is that your journey has taken you to this point over the years and over a long period of time. And to some extent, like you start as an academic with that big set of question marks, and that has taken you on a journey. And that journey in itself, I would consider that research.
Yeah.
That is in a broad sense, that is research, isn't it?
Yes.
Like, even like in your life experience, you conduct research and you get to a point where you acquire and develop a different understanding of yourself as a speaker of English, and ultimately almost like as a human being, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's so much part of your identity.
That's right. Yeah. It's a process.
It's a process.
And it's a process of, identity making and remaking, basically, for me.
That's why I say to my students, don't expect to understand everything instantly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, telling you these things, you're reading these things, it will take time, to really not absorb, but really understand and reflect and, kind of own all these concepts that you're hearing for the first time. And you're on a journey. Yeah.
True.
You're on
True.
a journey.
Yeah. I agree.
And it's interesting how the journey somehow begins often from a point of problem. There's something that needs resolving, doesn't it? And that gives you the initial stimulus to go on the journey. So there's something I'm not quite understanding, and you start on this journey. So the journey, so then in terms of almost like physical journey, took you from the Philippines to Singapore.
Yeah.
And you were in Singapore for a number of years.
20 years, yeah.
For 20 years.
Yeah.
And we were chatting about it before. I mean, even in terms of your kids, I mean, even that experience in Singapore must have marked your identity to some extent. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, again, very literally, the Philippines and Singapore are not too far from each other. So literally, I would actually also describe to my students, my literal journey from Singapore to the Philippines. You get out the airport, and then someone will ask you, why is your English like that? Like I said, like,
what do you mean?
Why? What do you mean? I'm Filipino, and I thought I'm, speaking in Philippine English. But actually, from the ears of a Filipino driver, all right, it's no longer the Philippine English that they hear a lot on the streets, right? But when I fly back to Singapore and I say, you're not Singaporean, is it? Because they hear something different, non-Singaporean as well. So there's, I mean, it's I don't want to call it conflicted really, but I think I'd like to call it more multiple kind of identities. And I actually treasure that more, rather than think of them as, as something negative. I used to, right? And I think quite a number of my friends and the people around me continue to think that, having all of these different varieties and different kinds of ways of speaking are a disadvantage because you need to only speak this one standard or this one language. But in a sense, it always is a point of conversation, all right? That's when I start explaining, that all right, so I'm actually from the Philippines, but I've lived in Singapore for 20 years.
Yeah.
So because sometimes, these are markers, of me and us and them, right? So
Yeah.
you have a Singapore driver telling me, for example, oh, you don't know this, you don't know this, but I keep
Yeah.
on telling him, I actually, all right, probably would have been born much earlier and would have been around more than you do. You've been. The same thing with my students in Singapore. Yeah, you're Singaporean, but I was already here before you were born.
Yeah. So I'm more Singaporean.
Yes, that kind. So it's a way, to me. My being in Singapore was a way to expand my understanding of myself.
Yeah.
All right. Because it has enriched basically, my repertoire, my cultural repertoire basically.
Yeah. And did you find, speaking of that, because I've had, to some extent a similar experience, because, I left Italy already, sort of 25 years ago. And leaving your country makes you more aware of certain aspects of your, in my case, of my Italianness.
Yes.
Also because it's only when you step out,
Exactly, yeah.
that then you become aware of certain things, including accent,
Exactly.
which I had no idea about until I left the country.
Yeah.
And now I'm getting the same kind of thing. When I go back to Italy, people will say that I speak with a strange accent in Italian.
Yes.
So it's not even a variety of English. I actually speak in Italian. And people will comment on that. And I find that sometimes a bit odd, kind of strange. What do you mean? I'm genuinely totally Italian. I like to consider myself that. But from the point of view of someone who hasn't perhaps left the country, it doesn't feel like that.
Yes.
And what's really interesting is the role that language plays in defining your own identity and in the eyes of other people, your identity as well.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
It's like interesting how people comment immediately, oh, you don't sound Filipino, or you don't sound Singaporean, or not exactly what I think a Filipino person should sound like.
Yeah.
And then you end up not sounding exactly anything.
Exactly.
But that's the negative view, isn't it? Whereas in a kind of additive, like we were saying before, perspective, it's a multiple addition of different segments of identities, all embodied in yourself.
Yeah.
And that is enriching. Rather
at your disposal as well.
At your disposal.
Yeah.
That you can navigate
exactly
according to context, etc. No, that I think arriving at this realization is a really good place to be. And even that takes time to sort of to come to terms with it. So Singapore, so Philippines is 20 years in Singapore, and then you landed in London.
Yeah.
At UCL.
5 years
You've been
ago,
there for 5 years.
Yeah.
How's that been, that transition?
Well, it's another transition.
Yeah.
Another huge transition.
Yeah.
But I guess the interesting thing is that in a sense, I look at the multilinguality of London, of the UK as well, and use that as a way to introduce the UK and London to my kids, because I have 3 kids, right? And curiously, interestingly, we expected more difficult times for them, but actually no. And I think it's probably because of the way we in a sense mapped out the place for them. That because Singapore is very, very multilingual, right? And so that whole idea of, like different races, people of different skin colors, for example, with different languages and different varieties, that somehow, somehow they carried them along with them, right, in London. And so when we presented London as similar, of course, with, the different configuration of multilingualism is, of course, is also different. But somehow the transition did not become as difficult and challenging as we thought it would be. And interesting, one realization for me actually is that actually there's so many Englishes in the center of English, and that actually gave me another layer of complexity to how I teach English and how I actually present English to teachers and educators in different parts of the world. Because it's a different view of English associated with the UK, for example. And yet it's a different kind of an experience when you actually see
it.
UK with
Yeah.
different Englishes, and actually it's important that you navigate these different Englishes, really.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how my kids also, in a sense, navigated the whole system and the whole culture.
Yeah.
They have Philippine English, they have Singapore
Yeah.
Singlish as well,
Yeah.
and of course here. So it's it's a matter of like shifting between these different varieties, and I think it's really a great thing.
So in a way, so the diversity that you found, the extreme diversity you find in London has actually been very, very beneficial for
Yeah.
you and your kids as well, to
Yes.
kind of, in a way, go to a place that on paper may have been quite different, but actually it's not as different as it,
Yes.
as it could
Yes.
have been. I
Yes.
suppose it would have been quite different if you had moved, say, somewhere quite a lot smaller
Yes,
in England.
that's right.
Much monocultural and mono
Yes,
everything.
you're right.
That
You're
could
right.
have been different, and
Yeah.
maybe tougher. But I think London is such a microcosm that it offers. Like you said, there's so many Englishes in the cradle of the English language in a way.
Yeah, that's
isn't
right.
it?
Yeah.
And that diversity of Englishes in London is quite interesting. And that kind of takes us to what I would consider, and tell me if I'm wrong, one of your main contributions to our academic field, which is the idea of unequal Englishes. Now, for someone who's not heard that term before, how would you explain it? Yeah, to someone who's not familiar with it.
Well, I guess I already started with London. London has many different Englishes, right? We hear different Englishes, but not all these Englishes are, perceived or valued well, or as well as others. So in other words, yes, we hear different varieties, we hear different Englishes, but only probably one or two of these varieties are what's privileged, what's valued, what's acceptable to to a wide range of people, in society. The others are mocked, the others are laughed at, the others are devalued, right? And for all sorts of reasons. And that we shouldn't actually be doing that, precisely because if you look at just simply the varieties themselves, they're all logical, they're all systematic, they're all rule governed. They are not ungrammatical.
Yeah.
All right. They are linguistically systematic, in other words.
Yeah.
All right. So all of these accents and all of these Englishes that we hear around us, they're diverse, right? There are many, they're multiple, and they're fine. All right.
Yeah.
Except that, again, society judges, one English better than another. All right, but that has nothing to do with language. That has nothing to do with the linguistic aspect of it.
So those kind of evaluations and judgments are not really about language.
Oh yes, definitely. It's essentially judgments of the speakers of these varieties themselves.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really central concept, isn't it? Because we often, it's almost like what seems to be the case, that discussions about language are the site of often discussions about other than language. Even though I think the participants in these discussions may not be fully aware of that. So, what I'm trying to say, I don't know if you would agree with this, but that sometimes we talk about the value of this way of speaking or this variety, etc. And we seem to be focusing on grammatical issues or syntax or phonology and things like that. And maybe genuinely we think we're talking about that. But in reality, there's this underlying extra linguistic drive that somehow shapes the conversation.
Yeah.
And to what extent, sometimes I think what my impression is that sometimes that content is not particularly visible or even consciously there, but it's there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like you said, what people are really talking about is the speakers of varieties rather than this rule of grammar or this convention of phonology or whatever. Right?
Yeah, I mean, probably in very concise way, in a very concise way, any talk about language is actually not about language. It's about people. So when people talk about other people's accents, we all think that we are talking about accents, but actually
Probably
we're not
not.
talking about accents. We're
Yeah.
talking about the people who are producing those accents.
Accent become a proxy for something
Exactly. I
else,
think that's the
right?
word for it. Like it becomes a proxy for something, and therefore could actually be subtly dangerous because it actually is discriminatory,
Yeah.
right? Especially when you then start avoiding people because of their accents. Basically saying that you don't understand them because of their accents, when actually they're, you can actually understand them, but you just don't want to see them. You just don't want you just don't like the way they look, for example, right? You make, and even more than that, you make certain policies that, segregate one group from another. You come up with, classroom practices, for example, that somehow mock or marginalize or silence certain pupils in the classroom, for example. And it's all because of the things that you hear, like the accents or the dialects or even the languages that the pupils bring along with them as well. So so it's when you talk about language, it's really not about language, really.
Yeah.
All right, you talk about something else, and I think that's something that I always keep on telling everyone,
Yes.
every opportunity, because it's something that somehow jolts everyone as well. Like, what do you mean? Like, we're talking about language, and then you're telling me that
we're not
we're
really
not talking about language. So it takes time also to process it.
Yeah.
But then if you really want to unpack it, I mean, you can unpack it, because why in the first place would you mock an accent?
Yeah.
Because accents on their own, without people, are accents.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, that's, it makes me reflect on, like, if you think of the world English's paradigm, right? According to which, the basic principle is that, you have diversity of different varieties of English, but they're all equally valid, right? They're all equally legitimate, valid. There's no superiority or inferiority involved. And on the surface, all of that is about language. But actually, if you go back and look at the origin of world Englishes and how it started with Brudge-Catcher and so on, I think what they were really talking about, again, like what you are alluding to, was not really language, or not exclusively language. Although the terms that they were using, if you go and read those early papers back in the early 70s, they were about language. But fundamentally, when Catcher were responding to Prater, there was a lot of race involved in that. There was a lot of stuff to do with discrimination and prejudice, etc. And then again, even that, in that case, language was very much a proxy. It's almost like, I'm beginning to be persuaded that the whole world English's paradigm was built on considerations when they were not exclusively about language. They were about equality among people, rather than just varieties of English.
Yeah, because the discourse of world Englishes, at least the earlier, world Englishes paradigm is heavy on empowerment. Like empowering non-native speakers of English, basically letting the non-native speakers of English believe that their English is not, deficit, or it's not, corrupted or ungrammatical. So in the process of doing so, it is about, in a sense, making their lives better. To, in a sense, allow for spaces in society for them to thrive and probably be paid equally as all other speakers of English as well, right? So ultimately, it's actually was always getting there, right? About the politics of it, about the power that's invested in speech and in people, and not just simply the Englishes as well.
Exactly. So would you say that the concept of unequal Englishes, what it mainly does is that it uncovers the non-linguistic in the concerns that world Englishes has, if that makes sense?
Yes.
Right? World English seems to be about, but what unequal Englishes does is like, hey guys, what we're really talking about is much more than language.
Yes.
And all the inequalities that exist that surround language, and they're about people. So in some way, the unequal English's lens complements rather than contradicts the world English's perspective.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. That's why in a lot of my work, it's always about pushing world Englishes forward in the conversation, because I think to me it has to be part of the conversation. So it builds on the very idea of linguistic equality to start with, all right? Except that I think the way it's being mobilized in a lot of research doesn't really give a lot of importance and a lot of central work to questions of inequality. And even more than that, it actually trivializes these questions. So that's what I'm really after. It's not so much the defects of the paradigm itself, because it builds on it. You know, it's the manner by which it has been mobilized. And I would actually think, you know, I mean, some of my friends actually would know this, that actually I thrived in the part, you know, the part where the period where Kachru was actually thriving, you know, in world Englishes, because that was when it was very strong politically, you know, the idea of power. But for somehow along the way, it has been depoliticized. And much of the work is now descriptive. It describes, and somehow where are the speakers? All right. Where are, you know, issues of power and politics, when it was the world Englishes was very much central to it was really questions of power and politics, right? And somewhere along the way, it has
kind of got diluted.
Exactly.
So obsessed with classifying this and that and describing this and that, losing sight of the real thing. So in some way, the unequal English is it's almost like bringing us back to the origin. Sort of the
surfaces,
ethos.
But it just simply surfaces, and basically the idea being that the struggle continues. All right, let's not gloss over it. You know, the struggle continues and stuff like that.
So here's a big question then: the struggle continues. Where's the end of the struggle?
No, I think that I don't see the end really.
Right.
You know, because if we have to change our lens from language to people, to individuals, from English to the speaker, right? You look at the speaker, and therefore it's not just simply a question of language, like the speaker and their place in, you know, in the much larger spaces in society, right? And so if you're talking about, I don't want to talk about the end, but the process is transforming society basically, you know, and their lives, you know, so it's not just simply the way they speak, but how they live their lives and their relationship with people, which is of course unequally distributed in terms of power as well. So it's more along those lines. So dealing with, you know, unequal Englishes is above all really dealing with, you know, individual lives of people. You know, so it's beyond the classroom really.
And do you feel that we linguists or sociolinguists have a role to play, or, you know, or do we sometimes sin of considering language a little bit too important, and you know what I mean? So I'm almost beginning to think, in all of this, do we, you know, we talk about struggle, etc. So do we actually have a real role to play in all of this? And what is it?
Well, I guess if you look at it in terms of realizable, operationable role, I've written a little bit about this. It's in the context of decentering language.
Right.
Really, I mean, as our work as social linguists, I think we must ironically decenter language in our work. Because when we actually look at the individual rather than the language itself, then we look at the individual and their place in society, in everyday practice. So when that becomes your lens is now figuring out how does this individual live their lives, you know, in everyday, you know, practice, for example, and what is the role of language there, instead of what is the role of language even before you actually knowing the individual. So it's you know, at least as what I said, you know, if it's realizable kind of role, change the lens. Look at the individual. Look at the speakers. How do they live their lives, for
Yes.
example? And, even the way you approach research and the way you approach your own scholarship will also somehow radically change because of that.
Yeah.
Because I think we're all just so too focused on language
Yes.
that somehow we lose sight of, I mean, I've written about this,
Yeah.
in world Englishes, we've so much focus on where English is rather than focus on the world.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what is this world that we all operate in? I think
Yeah.
there's very little understanding. I think,
Yes.
unfortunately, of course, I mean, generally speaking, right, in these kinds of studies, right? So it's just by changing the lens, I think, there's already something that we can do.
So in some way, almost paradoxically, what we are saying is we as linguists need to recalibrate the place of language in our understanding of what's going on.
Yes.
And I like your in world Englishes, we need to really look at world as well as Englishes to really make sense of everything more holistically and more comprehensively.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah, and the thing is that when we decenter language in order to understand the individual, eventually we bring the language back as well to the equation, right? And see, so we have a different understanding of the role of language, and we know that there is that role, but we just don't make these a priori assumption that always central to everyone's life is, this language or that language or this variety. What is its role in the overall life of that particular individual? So in a sense, it highlights, the importance of language without necessarily centering it as your goal for your research.
Yeah, it's interesting because all of that also requires a certain degree of humility as well.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
To kind of to almost like move away from the centrality of language and recalibrate. What's also interesting that you said, and then bring it back in its right place, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And have a much better understanding.
And because the right place for a certain community is differently configured if you look at another community of speakers as well. So it's looking at the role of language in specific configurations of relations as well. So
that's right. Yeah. I've got one final question that it's kind of very closely related to what we've been discussing now. And it's something that, I've always struggled with as a concept, the owning a language. So for example, the ownership of English, as something I discuss in class with my students as well. And the students always sort of very often, find the concept not particularly clear to understand. What's your take on it?
Well, it's really, again, it's a matter of when you're talking about owning language, I go back to what I earlier said about owning yourself and your own identity, right? I think I only came to terms with owning my English when I came to terms with my identity,
right?
And that is exactly for shifting, from being a non-native speaker of English to a multilingual speaker of English.
Yeah.
And that's actually when I really started to really say, this is who I am. Now, owning a language or owning your variety doesn't necessarily mean you have all the power to keep it.
Yes.
Because in the end, there will always be resistance, right? But I don't think ownership is dependent really on to what extent people resist you, but to what extent do you actually accept yourself, your identity, and that particular variety, and how then you negotiate, these unequal power relations with people who keep on resisting you, right? So in a sense, to me, as an example, whenever I say I'm a multilingual speaker of English, it doesn't mean to say that when I send up my CV to any institution, private institution, I will be given a salary of equal value to someone who just graduated from a university in the United States, for example. It still is there, but I know who I am. I know what I'm capable of, and that's where I continue resisting it. So it doesn't mean that everything is resolved in the world, but the resolution is in you, basically, that you now have come to terms with your own identity.
Exactly. So ownership then is mostly a relationship that you as an individual have with English, and rather than something somehow given to you.
Yeah.
I'm saying this because, I go back to the famous 1994 paper by Henry Widdowson, where he said,
Yes.
the ownership of English, etc. And I always found that slightly problematic because it's almost like he is saying everybody owns this language.
Yeah.
And from a position of relative privilege,
Yeah.
I'm happy to say everybody owns this language, but ultimately what really counts is the individual speakers and how they feel about it.
Yeah.
Without that resolving the problems particularly, but at least it's something that you have to feel from the inside, so to speak, rather than being told by somebody, it's your language. That may or may not mean anything.
Yeah. And I also think of owning as something that is not really finite, I think.
Right.
I think owning is a process, really. It's a process. And I keep on saying this, it's a struggle, really.
Yes.
So by saying so, it doesn't mean that everything is resolved. There's a resolution to it, but you're already defining, the language that you use and who you are according to your own terms.
Yeah.
And you are consciously aware of it. And so when let's say our students or some people resist this whole idea of ownership, then I think there's certain resolutions within themselves. I think that they need to also reconcile and address first before coming to terms with the whole idea of ownership. Yeah, but I guess I completely agree with you regarding the 1994 paper. It's like, okay, now it's yours.
It's yours.
So
yes.
it's never going to be like that. Yeah, it's not like that. I think it's a process that you have to negotiate yourself as an individual speaker.
And I always try to resist the temptation when I'm in class and students will say to me, "No, I don't think I own English language. For me, it's almost like a borrowed entity, etc." And I'm tempted to say, come on, but it is yours, blah, blah, blah. I want to kind of override that sentiment. And it's completely not the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely because I think it's not about the owning the variety or the language. That's the problematic thing there. It's just they're owning themselves, their own identity.
Well, that's it. Yes.
And that takes much longer process.
Yeah. Which basically takes us back to the beginning, the idea of journey, intellectual journey, sometimes physical journey, development, and these ideas that keep developing and moving forward, and the struggle that continues as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Well, it's been really, really interesting. I mean, this conversation could go on literally forever. But we're going to end it here. Thank you very much, Ruanni.
Thank you for the invitation as well.
Yes, thank you. It's been really, really interesting.
Yeah.